couple of months ago, we released a video where I claimed that Golden Freddy never existed, and that this entire time he was just a hallucination conjured by Mike, possibly while being possessed. And then, last week, Matpat put out a video called Golden Freddy Never Existed. But, assuming that Golden Freddy is a hallucination and was never real, what would this mean for the series? Well, that's what we're exploring today, and be sure you let me know in the comments if you think Golden Freddy is real or not. Number 6, the one you should not have killed. If Golden Freddy is purely a hallucination, this opens a whole lot of doors, particularly in the identity of the one you should not have killed. You see, the original basis for my point of Crying Child being the one possessing Afton was that Golden Freddy being possessed by Cassidy prevented her from possessing anyone else. However, if Golden Freddy isn't real, then Cassidy can't really be possessing it, and that leaves the door open for Cassidy to possess William. Another issue I'd see would be that Crying Child, if they are to possess someone, it would end up being a relative, considering how he dies in the hospital, and since Crying Child dies in 1983 instead of 1985, he would end up possessing William first, and then Cassidy couldn't. But that's also assuming that Crying Child does possess someone and doesn't just pass into the great beyond once Nightmare gets him or once he survives him. However, Cassidy can be possessing William if, and at 5, Michael is possessed. If Michael was with his brother when he died, or the bite was the moment that triggered the possession due to intense agony despite him dying later, Michael being possessed also explains why he'd be seeing Golden Freddy. Because if the line of "it's me" is in fact Crying Child communicating with his older bro through hallucinations like my original theory stated, then Golden Freddy would just be a representation of the thing that killed Crying Child. Michael would also have been in the hospital when Crying Child died, since, you know, it is his brother after all. And this also helps everyone who was yelling at me in the comments, saying that he would blame his big brother for his death over his father. My original explanation was that he just possessed the closest thing to him, which could have been his father, and then only got vengeful once he saw what his father was doing. But if Golden Freddy is a hallucination, we need an explanation as to why, and Michael being possessed fits the bill. And it's more consistent than him just being tired, stressed, neglected, and all the other stressors that I mentioned in my theory on the subject. Although those are still perfectly valid and are probably not really helping. Michael being possessed by Crying Child and him causing hallucinations also explains the survival logbook. The wrong text and faded text isn't really two spirits having a conversation, but rather the hallucinations that Crying Child is making Mike see. And it also explains that the party we see at the end of FNAF 4 isn't for Crying Child, but rather for Michael. Hence the "party was for you" line being repeated multiple times, and why Michael had his friends there if the party was for his younger brother. Or the altered text could even be Michael's inner thoughts as he's realizing what has happened. This fixes a whole lot of other issues as well, allowing for William to be possessed by Cassidy, who taunts him in Ultimate Custom Night with the thing that had killed his son. It allows for Michael's hallucinations to be more based on FNAF lore than real world science, which in turn explains the clues that he gets in FNAF 3's minigames, and even explains why he thought punching a phone number onto the wall tiles would actually do something for him, and why it does. And it stops the stupid Golden Freddy was possessed by two souls theory brought on by the logbook, because if Michael was hallucinating, then I would doubt any of that is real, including the blood on the cover and within the book itself, because that was also an issue for me. Why would Fazbear Entertainment be like, here's a book and it's covered in blood? And at 4, FNAF 4 was a game. This would also mean that FNAF 4's main gameplay was actually a game. Now, I know that in Matpat's theory he comes to the conclusion that the first 3 or 4 games aren't real. I haven't seen the whole thing as to not shift my judgment or bias my findings. However, I'd argue that the first 3 games would still need to be real, and not just at a random time of day with a notification that ironically interrupts you from being real. No, FNAF 1 through 3 would have to happen for the rest of the series to make sense. The outlier is FNAF 4, whose main gameplay can't really have happened, or at least, if it did, it wasn't what we thought. The FNAF 4 Between Night minigames have to be real, cause like that's the moment that really starts the whole everything getting possessed thing, but one thing that's always bothered me was the nightmare animatronics. If this is supposed to be Crying Child in a coma having these nightmares, how does Mike know what they look like, since he draws Fredbear's nightmare version in the survival logbook? One way could be that this was just kind of projected into his brain when Crying Child possessed him, or it could also be that these were simply Michael's nightmares, hence the alarm clock wake up and similar hours that he's had to previous jobs. But another could be that this character simply was one in the games that Scott's in-universe counterpart made, which I feel is the most likely explanation, since it also explains how the character made it into FNAF VR. That also brings up the issue of copyright law in the FNAF universe itself, since Fazbear Entertainment would have had to buy the rights to the Nightmare version of the character off of Scott in-game. However, maybe they didn't, since FNAF VR did have a scandal when the first version of the cover art was revealed, since it had used a fan model in the art, thus violating copyright law, which is certainly an odd thing, since, you know, the man created the series, so how did he or anyone on a team accidentally use an asset that they would have had to find and download online? Wouldn't you like have those already, or wouldn't you just get them from Scott? Maybe it was a hint to how some of these characters would be violating in-universe copyright laws as well. We know some of these characters are real, like the original animatronics, but even Springtrap was a real animatronic, since the Fazbear Frights Ruins and Springtrap make a cameo at the end of Sister Location. So, FNAF 3 had to be real, otherwise it would have been Scraptrap showing up instead. In at 3, FNAF 3 ending explained. All of this also explains the FNAF 3 endings, and why Golden Freddy's head isn't present in the good one. Yes, no lights being on would make the head in the back harder to see, but that symbolism of being behind them, watching them from the shadows, isn't lost on me, and is explained as Crying Child watching these souls while possessing Michael. And when these souls are free, in that ending, we actually see the heads of the actual animatronics, like the physical heads. And since Golden Freddy was never real, there need not be a head for the character. Plus, Cassidy would still be possessing William at this point and thus not set free. Clearly, since, you know, the man survives the fire of that game. So the Golden Freddy in the Happiest Day minigame could very well just be Crying Child finally conquering his fear of Fredbear. Hence why Golden Freddy doesn't make an appearance in future games. Sister Location doesn't have one, or any hallucinations for that matter. Pizzeria Simulator is the same way, except I personally think that FNAF 6 is also a game. FNAF VR only had Easter eggs of the It's Me line, which has been found by few, and Easter eggs are a really gray area for this, especially when it's an Easter egg in a DLC. But even still, the character themselves doesn't show up. After FNAF 3, it seems like Crying Child has let go of his anger towards his brother and the fear of the animatronic, which is why he is no longer hiding in the shadows and no longer taunting Michael with visions. But ultimately, in at number 2, FNAF 6 is a game. If this Golden Freddy hallucination idea is true, and everything else that I've suggested is as well, since it would only make sense for all that to actually happen, that would mean that FNAF 6 is also one of the games. Not only is it another outlier like FNAF 4, but it's the only game to feature Scraptrap and Scrap Baby. Now keep this in mind, because like Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, that is a special tool that we'll use for later. Because the whole point of FNAF 6 is tying up loose ends. It's ending the story. It's letting the remaining secrets of Fazbear Entertainment die off. Now, Henry aims to achieve this using a random person, seemingly, since he clearly states the job listing wasn't intended for Michael at the end of the game. And no matter how counterintuitive that may be, everything important here is kept a secret. Or well, I get the animatronics found in the back alley are. Scraptrap, Scrap Baby, Lefty, Molten Freddy, they're all very hush-hush. They're left out back at the end of your shift, in the dark, they're kept away from any of the patrons, and anyone who knew about them is supposed to die at the end of the game, along with the location being buried as we see in Security Breach. And while the location and its fire may have been true, notice that Burn Trap is more like Springtrap than Scrap Trap, despite Scrap Trap supposedly being the literal basis for Burn Trap. It would have to go directly from Scrap Trap to Burn Trap. Oh, and remember that surprise tool? The whole this is the only game to feature these? Combining that with anyone who knew about these being dead, how did these characters show up later? How did Scrap Baby make it into FNAF VR as a plush baby skin? And how are they both in Ultimate Custom Night? Nobody should have known enough to put her in FNAF VR, and then Ultimate Custom Night? Well, that also has the Nightmare animatronics, who we've established as having to be game characters. Therefore, FNAF 4 being a game and the origin of the Nightmares makes any game featuring those in universe games as well. Ultimate Custom Night and VR also make mention of scrap characters, who then also have to be game characters, meaning that FNAFs 4, 6, and 7 are all video games made by Scott in universe. But most importantly, we can stop worrying about the Springtrap to Scraptrap to Burn Trap design changes, because in reality it went from Springtrap to Burn Trap, and Scraptrap was there to avoid copyright issues issues with Fazbear Entertainment. And finally, in at number 1, Michael isn't Glamrock Freddy. I'm sorry to break it to you guys, but this would also mean that Michael is not possessing Glamrock Freddy, and it could be for multiple reasons. One, it could be that Crying Child is still possessing him at the time of FNAF 6's fire, which would keep him alive, much like William in Burn Trap's suit. We know that Crying Child keeps possessing Michael after FNAF 3, given that he survives Ennard and then Ennard's departure, which it could only be done if he was possessed and being kept alive like William, unless Mike is a robot. 2, since FNAF 6 is a game, Mike may not really have been at the location when it burnt down. Henry may have done it all himself, or maybe actually he let Mike leave instead of, not giving him the choice like we see in the actual game, which basically resulted in Henry murdering Michael. Or the third scenario, which I personally prefer, that Scott's in-universe counterpart, the indie game dev who made FNAF 4, 6, and 7, is Michael, and that he used these games to tell a version of the story where he dies so that he can either live a more normal life or prevent suspicion from Fazbear Entertainment if they looked into his past a little too closely. And if I'm throwing another wild theory out there, what if the FNAF movie, the one using the Mike screenplay, will feature Scott Cawthon at his desk working on a game as an older version of Michael? There is a reason that he used himself for that photo and made sure we knew it wasn't Scott himself, because he knew that whenever he wanted to reveal the game dev's identity, he would be available. And if he used someone else, they may have not been able to make it to set for the final shot of the movie. And if you're interested in more theories about the FNAF movie, be sure you check out the list on that topic, okay? It's popping up on your screen now. Thanks for watching.